still have the highest batting average, you win the batting title. Well, he still would have won the batting title, but I always wondered, what if he had hit 401, but he was 10 plate appearances shy?
Right.
What's on his baseball card the next year? What was officially? And I actually reached out to Elias and asked them about that, and they never responded. Maybe because that rule has never come into play, and they probably didn't want to say, "Oh, well, yeah, here's what we would do." Maybe they just didn't know, or maybe they didn't want to, establish precedent because, of course, were this to happen later in the year, coming up in later years, everyone would immediately, of course, point to my book as the definitive thing.
Right. You would have been the reference.
What to do in this situation. So.
Yeah, and obviously, whenever I think of George Brett, I mean, he had an amazing career, but I always think of the pine tar thing in 1983.
Yeah, the pine tar, and then of course the hemorrhoid issue in the 1980 World Series. That's one of his jokes, is that he's happier to be known as the pine tar guy than the hemorrhoids guy. So
there you go. And then in the National League West, it was the big race was between Houston and the Dodgers, but man, the thing about Houston is that you just got to feel for J.R. Richard getting a stroke.
Yeah, I mean, I think if J.R. Richard stays healthy that whole year, I think the Astros would win the World Series. Because, like you said, they came down to the final weekend of the season, and actually Houston had a 3-game lead going into the final week of the season, weekend of the season, played the Dodgers in L.A. and got swept. So they went to a tiebreaker, game 163, and Houston ends up winning that. Going to the playoffs, they go 5 games because the NLCS at the time was just 5 games. But, man, a healthy J.R. Richard, especially with as dominant as he was that year, I think they would have won the division certainly earlier, which would have allowed them to set up their pitching rotation. And I would not want to face J.R. Richard, Nolan Ryan, and Joe Niekro in a short series.
Oh, my goodness.
With a knuckleballer sandwiched in between two guys that can throw 100 miles an hour in a short series, that would have been really tough. And it would have been really tough, and I think the Astros would have come out on top.
Yeah. I mean, that league championship series was so close anyway. So that probably would have put the Astros over the top. But yeah, it's such a shame because everybody remembers Nolan Ryan because he played for it seemed like 100 years. He was his such great longevity. But yeah, J.R. Richard was just so good, but his career was cut short. But yeah, that National League Championship Series was called one of the greatest league championship series ever. It went all 5 games, and the last 4 were extra innings. In the 5th game, there were 3 lead changes in the final 3 innings alone. Wow, how crazy was that?
It was really an amazing series, and I mean, again, when the Astros had a 4 or 5 run lead in the 7th inning or 6th inning, something like that, of Game 5 with Nolan Ryan on the hill. And you figure, okay, you start. Let's make plans to go, to Kansas City for the World Series, and then things, And again, if you go back, and all those games are on YouTube, so you can go back and watch them all. And little things like Bob Boone hit a number. I think it was Boone hit a number up the middle, and it should have been a double play ball, but Ryan tipped it, and it got out. And all of a sudden the Phillies had runners on first and second with nobody out instead of a double play, and so. Just all these little things start to happen, and Pete. There's this epic at bat with Pete facing Nolan Ryan, and Pete in full Pete mode. Watching the ball all the way in the plate and snapping his head back around and glaring back out at Ryan and stuff, and and then the other kind of subtext of that whole part was the fact that, according to Joe Morgan, I want to be fair about saying this. This is according to Morgan. He and Bill Verdon had kind of had a feud going on where Verdon was pulling him out of games at the end because, in his view, Morgan had called a players-only team meeting late in the season, and apparently, according to Morgan, that had upset Verdon and felt like that Morgan was stepping on Verdon's toes. So then Morgan gets pulled out of the game, and then he's saying, well, now, just at the time where we need veteran leadership, which is why they brought me here, I'm not in the game. I can't go out and talk to Nolan Ryan, settle him down. Nobody actually went out to talk to Ryan and settle him down in that situation. And, the argument could be made, it's Nolan Ryan. Maybe he doesn't need to be settled down. But on the other hand, just to have someone like Joe Morgan to come out and say, hey, we're okay. Let's, just to take a breath or just to let him step away for a little bit. Yeah. And so, I want to be fair because I've never heard Bill Verdon's side of that story. And I've heard many, many very good things about Bill Verdon as a manager and as a man. So I don't want to make this appear like I'm ripping Bill Verdon, but, Joe Morgan definitely did in his book. And so that was part of the subtext that was going on. And actually Morgan called the GM during that game and said, if we make it to the World Series, find yourself another second baseman because I'm not playing for Bill Verdon anymore. So wow. There were all these little, all this stuff going on the side of, that game and that series. And then of course there was the phantom triple play a couple of games earlier, with Vern Rule that was, just a crazy, crazy call. The argument and the discussion took close to a half hour. During the game, the Chubb Feeney was the National League president. He was there and they're going over, there was like 4 or 5 different arguments going on at different parts of the field, depending on who was involved in them. So it was just a fun series and an amazing series. And as a Phillies fan, I can say it was fun because they won. So, but I'm sure pretty painful if you're an Astros fan.
Yeah. It's funny. I still can't get over the Astros in the American League.
Yeah.
It's just weird. And now, and at the time, the Brewers were in the American League.
Right.
So it was just weird. And then in the American League, basically the story was the Royals finally got over the Yankees. The Yankees kept beating them in previous years, and the fourth time was a charm.
Yeah, and really that was another one of the really interesting things to me when you look at these two teams, is you have two teams that both had won their divisions in 76, 77, and 78, had been bumped in the playoffs all 3 years, and in like to your point, in Kansas City's case, it was by the same team. And so the Royals finally break through, and really, there was one of the big instances was in Game 2 where the Yankees third base coach Mike Ferraro sent Willie Randolph home on a ball that was hit in the outfield. The Royals executed a textbook relay throw and ended up hosing Randolph at the plate on a ball that Bob Watson hit off the wall, and that was what so incensed George, and that was what led to Hauser leaving the team. And then the next game, they go to Game 3 back in Yankee Stadium, and Brett hits the monster shot off of Goose Gossage to win the game, and took his sweet time getting around the bases. That had to be pretty sweet for Royals fans to finally knock off the mighty Yankees after a team that had, like we said, had beaten them in playoffs 3 out of the last 4 years.
Yeah. So then the World Series is the Royals against the Phillies. It was the first all artificial turf World Series, and if you're a little young before that era, most of this, well, not necessarily, a lot of the stadiums were those cookie cutter artificial turf. Just nothing special about them, like Three Rivers Stadium, the one in Philadelphia, Cincinnati, St. Louis. I'm sure there were many others.
Atlanta was the other one too. The only difference was that they had grass, but yeah, they were multi-purpose stadiums where the football team and the baseball team both played, and it was an interesting era. And those ballparks were state of the art when they were built. They talked about, it's funny, you go back and look at the paper from the reviews or whatever, and they're just talking about this glorious futuristic stadium, and now the trend is to go back to the stadiums before the glorious and futuristic stadiums with new amenities.
Exactly. In Pittsburgh, Three Rivers Stadium, I think, was built in 1970, and it replaced Forbes Field.
Right.
And Forbes Field still, I went to the University of Pittsburgh, and they still have parts of Forbes Field still up, like
the wall's
still
the
original wall.
Yeah, the left field wall. I've always wanted to go. Pay homage to Matt.
It's You gotta go on, I believe it's October 13th.
Okay.
Every year they do a reenactment of the 1960
Oh,
World
wow.
Series, and a bunch of people gather around and they have the radio broadcast of the game, and it's just such a cool experience. But yeah, when I went to University of Pittsburgh, I would go to classes. I would. And if I passed near the wall, I would touch it, and to me it was like a religious experience.
Sure.
It would be like people going to Jerusalem and touching the sacred things and stuff like that. And that was way before my time. But yeah, Forbes Field was not the greatest thing. It was pretty large, but still, yeah. Three River Stadium was considered state of the art, and then that's where when I grew up, going to games then, and and there were times when you could put like 50 or 55,000 people in a stadium, which was cool when the team was good, and you're in a large stadium, but yeah, I'd be in the upper deck, and you could, everybody looked like ants down there, so
Yeah.
It wasn't the greatest viewing experience, and nothing like the stadiums now. And I mean, my goodness, I think PNC Park is if not the best, one of the best stadiums. So they definitely went back to that trend. But another thing about that World Series is it was the first World Series where neither team won a World Series before.
Yeah.
And I don't think that'll ever happen again, or at least close to it.
Yeah,
So.
that's true. Yeah, I guess we could probably. Well, I mean, yeah, like if the Rays were to play the Rockies, maybe we could do that. But I mean, but I think the part of it too then was that at that point that was the Phillies' 97th year. So obviously the Royals had a much better excuse of being an expansion team from the 60s, but the Phillies had gone back to 1883, and so. Yeah, that was a big to do as well. I mean, and we talked about earlier just how bad they were for so many years. So, and it had been 30 years since they'd even been to the World Series.
Yeah, and they were able to win. And you also mentioned in the book that the makeup of the team. They changed managers, and it sounded like there was a lot of players that were just looking for their stats. They're just me first players, and they had to change to more of a team philosophy. How did that go?
It did not go well, at least initially. Dallas Green was he took over for Danny Ozark in 1979, and one of the first things he said was, don't get mad at me if I push you, because you guys are the reason that I'm here. If you had played better for Danny, he'd still be the manager. And he was a guy who didn't necessarily want to be a manager, at least at that point. He had the full support of the organization. He'd been the farm director for years. He was an organizational guy. He pitched for the Phillies. Actually, one of my favorite trivia questions is that Pete Rose hit one grand slam in his career, and it was off of Dallas Green. But so Dallas comes in and basically just didn't take any crap, and he pushed those guys. Pushed them a lot, and as you said, there were a lot of guys there who maybe wouldn't be all that upset if they lost, as long as they got their couple knocks that day. And Dallas challenged them to say, there's a couple instances where he just blew up and was yelling at guys and saying, we're too freaking good to be playing this poorly. And if you guys don't get it together, the window's going to close. I mean, and that was the big thing. They were saying that if that team hadn't won, they were going to break it up, because they had been to the playoffs 3 years before and hadn't gotten through. And then there was all the issues with the Carpenter family, who ended up selling the team basically a year later. So, yeah, it was an interesting era, but Dallas was not a guy. If you were a comfortable veteran, he was probably not the guy that you wanted as your manager. Although he brought them all a ring, so at the end of the day, I suppose it was a good thing.
Yep. Another great thing about your book is it's not just about baseball. You also bring in the pop culture things that happened in 1980, like Who Shot J.R. My goodness, I mean, we there's no way now that everybody would be engrossed in such a silly thing, but that was such a big deal.
It was a huge
at the time.
Deal. Yeah, I mean, and I think there's really no way to explain to people who didn't. I mean, there's no way to explain to people now how big of a deal that was then. And I was listening to an interview with Ricky Cobb, who does the Super 70s Twitter feed, a fantastic Twitter feed, and Ricky's a friend of mine. And one of the things that he said was in an interview was that you know, everybody may not have watched all these shows, but everybody knew about these shows. You may not have watched Laverne and Shirley every week, but you knew about Laverne and Shirley because there were only 3 networks and there were only so many shows, you know, and whereas now you've got people their entire fan communities built around these Netflix shows.